Hi, it's Katrina. Number 10. The Guanajuato Mummies. In the small city of Guanajuato in central Mexico, archaeologists were shocked to discover hundreds of terrifying mummies with their faces still twisted in terror from when they died. When the science fiction author Ray Bradbury visited Guanajuato back in 1947, he described the mummies he saw there as shocking and horrifying, claiming that he had nightmares after his visit. The story behind the mummies goes back to the 1850s, to a time when the world was stricken by a horrible cholera epidemic. Death rates in Mexico spiked significantly, so much so that they started running out of room in their underground crypts to put the bodies. As a result, they began burying the dead in new crypts above ground. But by 1865, the government had instituted a burial tax. This forced families to pay money to keep their family members buried in the ground. When the families couldn't come up with the taxes, the bodies of their loved ones were excavated and moved into a storage facility. It was when people stopped paying the tax and the bodies started being excavated that the first Guanajuato mummies were found. People were appalled to see that they still looked the same as when they died, twisted in their final moments of horror. In one case, the mummy of a woman was biting into her own arm. It was believed that she had most likely been buried alive when symptoms of her disease made her heart appear to have stopped. There was also a mummy of a woman who died in childbirth and her 24-week-old fetus. It is no surprise that Ray Bradbury was inspired by the gruesome and awful things he witnessed in Guanajuato, enough to write the next in line, a story about evil supernatural sources. Number 9. French Massacre. Archaeologists have discovered the mutilated remains of victims of a genocide in northeast France. But this was no recent genocide. It was a massacre that happened 6,000 years ago. Researchers uncovered 10 bodies inside an ancient pit, with the Neolithic people inside clearly having suffered horrible deaths. They showed proof of cuts all across their bodies, including deep lacerations to their heads. The bodies were also lumped together in such a way that suggests they were thrown into the pit haphazardly and without care. According to Philippe Lefranc, one of the archaeologists working on the case, these people were brutally executed, probably by some kind of axe. The remains included the bodies of 5 adults, an adolescent, and the arms of 4 other different individuals. These arms were likely war trophies, a fairly common practice at the time. The main theory right now is that a group of warriors from the Parisian Basin attempted to raid the area of Alsace, where the bodies were discovered. The raid, it seems, failed miserably. Ultimately, however, archaeologists say that the Parisians eventually successfully replaced the Alsacians by 4200 BC. The evidence can be seen in the changes in cultural artifacts of the time. Number 8. Haunted House Fail. There's nothing quite as creepy as the stuff you find in an abandoned house. But in Norway, South Carolina, things got extra ghoulish when a group of friends broke into a haunted house and stumbled upon a dead body. The group of friends had been driving around on their ATVs in a remote area when they came across the abandoned home that was rumored to be haunted. Naturally, they had to go in and check it out. At first, everything seemed the normal amount of creepy. The house was full of old junk, it clearly hadn't been lived in for quite some time, and it looked as if the Blair Witch may have been using it as her forest hideout. But as the group of teenagers rummaged through the house, they couldn't help but notice the putrid stench of rot that followed them everywhere. When they went to the back porch, the smell of rot was even more powerful. The only thing on the back porch other than a pile of garbage was a deep freezer. When they bravely opened the freezer, they saw a dead man in blue jeans and socks. They immediately ran away and called the authorities. Local deputies never were able to confirm the identity of the body, and 2 days after its discovery became public knowledge, the abandoned house mysteriously burned down. Number 7. Ancient Tombs. Archaeologists in Turkey have uncovered over 400 creepy tombs decorated with images of grapes and flowers, cut into the rock that date back at least 1800 years. These tombs were crafted in the ancient Greek city of Blondus, right around the 2nd century AD. At the time, the city was actually under Roman occupation. There were still a few Greek colonists in the city, but it was fully under Roman control. The Romans were using these elaborate tombs to bury their family members, and they weren't ordinary burials, but likely involved specialized funeral ceremonies. The Romans created a huge complex with vaulted tombs with the whole crypt sealed behind a massive marble door. The only time anyone was allowed inside was during a burial ceremony. Of course, we don't know exactly what went on in these ceremonies. By the time archaeologists started excavating, the bodies had already been stolen, and everything except the creepy paintings on the walls had been pillaged. What happened to the bodies is anybody's guess. It was hard to imagine why anyone would steal over 400 remains. Number 6. Monster Skull. In Canada's Yukon Territory, a miner accidentally dug up the fossilized skull of what is being described as an extinct monster. Stuart Schmidt was working near Dawson City when he uncovered the mysterious skull using heavy equipment. He noticed something bizarre sticking out of the gravel. He then climbed out of his machine and pulled the thing out with his hands. It turned out to be the almost perfectly preserved skull of an extinct North American helmeted muskox. Quite different to the modern tundra muskox, which looks a lot like a bison, in case you were wondering. 11,000 years ago, these animals were hunted by the first Native Americans who lived in Canada, eating and killing so many that they went extinct. But back then, these were huge monsters. They were about twice the size of a modern muskox, like mobile battering rams. These bulky giants weighed almost 1,000 pounds. After the discovery of the creepy skull, it was shipped off to paleontologist Grant Zazula with the territorial government. Scientists are now working to study the remains, hoping to carbon date the skull and do some genetic studies. What would you do if you found the prehistoric skull of a monster while at work? Would you hand it over to scientists or mount it on your wall? Let me know in the comments below, and remember to subscribe if you haven't already. Number 5. Missing tongue. Archaeologists found the body of a man near the small British village of Stanwick back in 1991. But it wasn't until just recently that Simon Mays, a human skeletal biologist, took a closer look at the mysterious skeleton. What he discovered is nothing short of horrifying. The skeleton is believed to be of a man who lived 1,500 years before today. He was discovered with a flat rock stuffed into his mouth. Why the rock was there was a mystery, but thanks to new advances in science, Simon and his team of researchers were able to determine that the individual suffered an oral infection at the time of death. The infection had spread to several other parts of his body, which probably resulted in his death in the first place. In all likelihood, the infection stemmed from a previous tongue amputation. In other words, his tongue had been cut out of his mouth had gotten infected, and that infection spread through his body and killed him. But to understand just how creepy this discovery is, we need to go back to the rock that was found in his mouth. According to Live Science, there have been multiple burials from between the 3rd and 7th centuries AD in Britain with some eerie similarities. Skeletons have been found with their heads missing, and in place of their head, a rock. Another skeleton with its foot missing had a pot put in place of the foot. The suggestion here is that for whatever bizarre reason, if a person was missing part of their body when they died, whoever buried them would replace it with a rock or a pot to symbolize the missing body part. Number 4. The parasite. Speaking of missing a tongue, a horrifying parasite was recently discovered at Galveston Island State Park in Texas. The parasite is a type of creepy marine organism called a tongue-eating louse, or a snapper-choking isopod. It detaches the tongue of its victim and then takes its place. The discovery was made by Corey Evans, a fish biologist with Rice University. He had actually been researching skull shapes in different fish when he came across an Atlantic croaker with something bizarre in its mouth. It turned out to be a type of isopod that invades a fish through its gills. This tongue-eating louse worms its way through a fish's gills, latches onto the fish's tongue, and then drains it of its blood. It even erodes all the tongue's muscle tissue until there's nothing left except bone. The isopod then attaches itself to the base of the bone where the tongue used to be, thereby becoming the tongue of the fish. It feeds off mucus and tiny bits of whatever the fish eats. Both animals remain alive, the fish doesn't seem to care, and everyone lives a long and happy life together. Still, this is incredibly creepy. According to Evans, these parasitic isopods are extremely common in the Gulf of Mexico. And even though a fish can live a full life with one of these parasites in its mouth, it sometimes will be infected by 2 parasites. A second isopod will move in through the gills, trying to get in on the first one's action. The fish will then have so many of these creatures in its mouth that it's unable to swallow its own food and starves in just a couple of weeks. Number 3. Dakota Ghost Town. An archaeological team working with the Nebraska State Historical Society may have just discovered the creepy remains of a cemetery that has been lost since the 19th century. In Dakota County near Omaha Creek, researchers are seeking further evidence of a cemetery once belonging to the town of Omadi. A few of the residents who had lived in the area for quite some time had heard stories about this long-lost Omadi cemetery, also known as Sand Ridge. But there had never been any photographs, headstones, or any other evidence to confirm the stories. Omadi's founding in 1856 was more than 10 years before Nebraska was even a state. The population here peaked at about 400 citizens, but before long, the waters of the Missouri River started to wash the town away. Combined with the boom in gold mining in nearby Colorado, the population of the town dropped from 400 to only around a dozen. By 1865, shortly after the town was founded, the place was a ghost town. All these years later, scientists finally decided to track down the abandoned cemetery used during the decade that Omadi was a booming village. It's estimated there are at least 30 people buried in the missing cemetery. The scientists had to use ground-penetrating radar over the plot of land where they believe the cemetery once stood. Today, the land is nothing but a field of grass where wildflowers grow. Unfortunately, the archaeologists are still investigating the radar images that they took. And while it does appear that something or someone is hidden underground here, there hasn't been any official announcements yet. Number 2. Naked shark. In July of 2019, fishermen in the Mediterranean Sea were pulling in their nets when they discovered a rare, unusual, and creepy discovery. Among hundreds of fish, sharks, and a variety of other marine life, there was a Blackmouth Catshark. Strangely, it had no skin or skin-related structures. It didn't even have any teeth in its mouth. This is extremely different from something like albinism, which is actually quite common. Scientists have found lots of sharks that have skin and pigmentation abnormalities, but this unusual naked shark is the first discovery of its kind, a living shark with no skin or teeth. And somehow, it was living a perfectly ordinary life before these fishermen rudely pulled it from its home in the sea. The fishermen handed the shark over to scientists who were able to determine it was 3 years old. It even had a belly full of food before the fishermen killed it. What's really baffling scientists now is how a shark with no teeth or skin managed to live for 3 years hunting other fish. It had a total of 14 food items in its stomach when researchers did the autopsy, including bony fishes, crustaceans, and even small cephalopods. Perhaps this is the world's only real-life gummy shark. Number 1. Mummy and skulls. A truly creepy mummy was recently discovered in the ancient city of Luxor in Egypt when its tomb was opened for the first time in 3,500 years. What made this mummy exceptionally creepy? It was surrounded by over 450 statues and funeral masks, as well as skulls and bones, coffin fragments, and more. According to the Egyptian Antiquities Minister, the tomb was probably made during the 18th dynasty, between the rule of King Amenhotep II and King Thutmose IV. Researchers don't actually know who the creepy mummy was during their life, but they are fairly certain it was someone important. They were definitely important enough that after being mummified and placed in their tomb, skulls of other people were left behind. Perhaps 3,500 years ago, the skulls were those of servants, sacrifices, or something else meant to keep the mummy company while they journeyed to the afterlife. There is still a great deal of the tomb that is unexplored, so we'll have to wait for more information to be revealed. Thanks for watching! What's your favorite creepy discovery? Let me know in the comments below, and remember to subscribe if you haven't already. See you next time! Bye!